Welcome to the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast, the untold stories of the 3HO Kundalini Yoga community. I'm your host, Guru Nishan, and at the beginning of every episode, I read the intentions for why I started this podcast. I was born and raised in 3HO, and so I started this podcast, number one, to break the veil of silence that has long permeated and continues to strangle the 3HO Kundalini Yoga community in the name of neutrality. Number two, to validate and help clarify the complex feelings of those who have joined this lifestyle, were born and raised into it, and or who have practiced or taught Kundalini Yoga. Number three, to encourage active listening to uncomfortable conversations from our community as a revolutionary act of self and collective healing. Number four, to let survivors know that we see them, we believe them, we love them, and we will fight for their truth to be addressed. Number five, to let teachers who are denying, gaslighting, or spiritually bypassing know that what they are doing is willfully ignorant and re-traumatizing victims. Number six, to illuminate the inherent racism, homophobia, cultural appropriation, and exploitation that perpetuates the teachings, 3HO lifestyle, and overall community ethos. Number seven, to stop the perpetuation of gaslighting and victim shaming by naming it for what it is. Number eight, to dismantle internalized shame, guilt, toxic positivity, and light-washing mentality. Number nine, to honor all of the parts of ourselves that have been forgotten or silenced. Number 10, to honor each and every body that has come through our community, both named and unnamed. And number 11, to encourage people to do their own research, process their own emotions, get therapy and other support, somatic therapy as needed, draw your own conclusions, and to be critical thinkers rather than to just blindly follow or believe anyone. Please remember that your story matters. Please share it when you're ready. We're here to listen and to support you. On today's episode, we actually have a guest who was formerly on our podcast in episode number 8, and I do encourage you to go back and listen to his original podcast episode with us. Dr. Ron Alexander, formerly Shama Singh, is a mind-body psychotherapist, international trainer of healthcare professionals specializing in creativity and trauma. He was recruited by Yogi Bhajan to co-found the original Kundalini Research Institute, KRI, in 1973, as well as co-founded the Center for Health and Healing at Cedars Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. He conducted the early scientific research on Kundalini Yoga and other forms of meditation, including Zen and Vipassana, through the Veterans Memorial Hospital in Topeka, Kansas, and Santa Rosa Psychiatric Hospital in Santa Rosa, California, both in association with the Menninger Psycho-analytic Institute in Topeka, Kansas. He has been teaching yoga psychology, mindfulness, and trauma-informed yoga since 1974, and travels the world now teaching and conducting trainings and workshops. He's the author of Wise Mind, Open Mind, Finding Purpose and Meaning in Times of Crisis, Loss, and Change. And his forthcoming book in spring of 2022, Core Creativity, a mindful approach to unlocking your creative abilities. For more information, you can go to ronaldalexander.com. I'm happy to have Dr. Ronald Alexander back on our podcast. In episode number 8, he spoke to You spoke to leaving early, being the early recruited to be one of the scientists of KRI, and then leaving and actually being a part of when Kate Felt and Pamela were leaving at that time, and just like really on the inside. And I'm just so grateful for your trauma-informed background and all of the research you've done in the world of intersection of healing, trauma, and spiritual abuse. And on that note, I think we really need some support, and listeners need some support on really what the heck to do with all of this.
Yeah, in 1979, I was involved from 1973 to 79. And then I was approached, I think in 1986, by the attorneys for Pamela and Kate Felt to do the psychological interviews. And so after I interviewed both Pamela and Kate, I think it was very quick, like within 10 days after I submitted my report, that Yogi Bhajan then settled through an unnamed Sikh charity in Vancouver and paid each of them off to avoid further litigation because of the strength of my psychological findings, having interviewed each of the women about the severity and the extent of their physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, and in both, especially in Pamela's case, that she had been forced to undergo an abortion in India as a result of involvement with Yogi Bhajan sexually, and almost died on the plane from Delhi to London vis-a-vis blood loss. And then the horrific amount of physical and sexual abuse and rape of Kate Felt, the breaking of her jaw, the biting of her face and lips, being held down by her own sister, was one of the attendants. I believe her name was Guru Amritkar. And that was one of, I've been in the trauma field since 1970. And I would have to say that still to my day, other than that I've interviewed a couple of women in Eastern Europe who were traumatized through the wars and rape and abuse. But Kate Felt's interview was up there with one of the most upsetting clinical interviews I ever experienced. And whenever I think of it, it's still upsetting to this day. That here was this guru all dressed in white and having everybody else dress in white, and then just physically, raping and beating and terrorizing not only Kate and Pamela, but a whole host, as we now know. I call it the Me Too movement within 3HO.
Yes.
So many first generation, second generation children that, he was using the school in India as a hunting ground for the younger girls.
Literally grooming.
And also the irony of that he would have this women's summer camp for 4 to 8 weeks every summer. And I can't tell you, I've spoken over the years to 10 different women as patients who've come to me, who have all were either attempted to be groomed and or were groomed and then underwent, serious sexual involvement with him as a result of that. The pure ones gathering together out of the, Adi Shakti, Grace of God movement.
The KWTC, Grace of God movement, literally just using it as a ground of plucking. And you're saying you weren't in the Dharma at this time. You're saying as patients that came to see you, this was something you got, because you're right there in Los Angeles.
Yeah, because I was in Los Angeles and I was practicing at Cedars Sinai, and I had co-founded the Center for Health and Healing.
Yeah.
along with two of the primary Sikh doctors at that time. And so after I left, I was still there in the next office. And so people would come to me who were undergoing, abuse and torment. And I would help them to, over time, heal and then to exit, extract themselves. And then I also worked with, from afar, someone who is a cult expert. I was never a cult expert. I was, as I said, more of a research scientist. But there was a fella, and to this day, he still is probably at the vanguard. His name is Stephen Hassan.
Yeah.
Dr. Stephen Hassan. You might want to.
I've been speaking to him about not speaking directly, but I've been talking about having him come on, and he had asked about the podcast.
Yeah, and in the early days, he and I used to co-refer clients back and forth to each other. And he went on to become a very esteemed expert in the area.
So at this time, when people would come to you as a therapist, and this was happening repeatedly, like, this is happening, like there's nothing you can do. Did you speak to other people that were in 3HO still, even though you had left?
Very rarely, only on the periphery.
But weren't the other two doctors you were saying that you co-founded Sinai with?
Yeah, the Center for Health and Healing. One of them, his name was Dr. Jaswant Singh Khalsa, and his English name is Jeffrey Hawkins. And he and I had a lot of conversations, and he shortly left somewhat in the early 80s also.
Got it. Can you give listeners just a little background in terms of how you started and then when you left, and kind of like your original joining with KRI, and then, but not too much because I know we don't have too much time, just a little history so that we can get to the context of, I just feel like right now there's just so much confusion, like with all this Me Too movement and then predator abuse, financial abuse, spiritual abuse, psychological abuse, physical abuse, like all this being exposed, and it's like what to keep. There's the yoga, and it's so confusing when there's good practices that are used in predatory ways. And so to have a little history about like when you identified that and then watching it from outside, and then now for it to be exploding, I'd really like your lens on all that.
Yeah, and I think, Guru Nishan, the way you just said that is extremely well said, is when there are good practices, the kind of separation that's needed so that one can, in essence, salvage the purity and the usefulness of whether they're meditative and or yogic practices from the abusive behavior of the teacher. So oftentimes in the current vernacular, there are two polarities. There are those of us who believe that you can salvage the purity of the teachings. And what I oftentimes refer to in Kundalini Yoga is the essence of the technology on the bad behavior and the corruption and the moral deficits of the teacher. And because I came up in the late 60s and early 70s, not only was I involved in helping people to exit from 3HO, but also many of the Zen centers around the country. People would reach out to me because, for example, it's very well known in the Buddhist circles that there was a lot of mayhem occurring with Roshi Baker in San Francisco. And I worked with a lot of the people from the San Francisco Zen Center and the Tassajara Zen Mountain Center, where I studied for over a 23-year period. And Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, very notorious, an extraordinarily brilliant Dzogchen Tibetan and Vajrayana teacher, who he founded the Naropa Institute and the Shambhala Society. And it was very well known that he was a raving alcoholic who died, I think it was either 44 or 46. And then he passed on his lineage to a fellow named Ozil Tenzing, who ended up giving HIV to, I think, 9 of his disciples. So that I was in the front lines of really sorting out a lot of really corrupt spiritual teachers. However, having studied with some of these, I call them the cats and characters, their teachings were brilliant. And, of course, I would, well, you asked how I got involved. I was involved with a counseling center called Room to Move at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and I was interning there. And we co-linked with a distinguished speakers program through UMass Amherst in Amherst College with a fellow named Richard Cohen. And so we brought to both UMass Amherst and Amherst College Robert Thurman, who was actually a faculty member at Amherst College at the time, Alan Watts, Ken Kesey, Ram Dass, Joseph Campbell, a long list of very prolific philosophers, thought leaders, spiritual teachers at the time. And so we brought to Amherst College, I was taking a course on world religions. And so we brought to Amherst College just a few of these folks, for example, Sasaki Roshi from the Zen Center in Los Angeles. And then the following week, we brought out Yogi Bhajan. And so after the class, he taught a 2-hour class. We went up and introduced ourselves and said, gee, we would like to study you scientifically. And then, of course, he started the whole indoctrination, the seduction, come be my guest in Los Angeles. And it was all about being recruited and being seduced, coming to Los Angeles and being praised and the lavish dinners and him showing us his jewels. Now, I came from a very simplistic Irish Catholic background of 10 children. So I was not impressed with jewelry and fur coats and all this nonsense. I mean, I actually found Zen before I found Kundalini Yoga. And so I was always into the simple ethic of less is better than more. And so that kind of, I called it extravagant buffoonery. Really a red flag for me. Like, why does this guy, if he's such a master, need to show us all his jewels? And he's got all these fur coats, and he's got these women dressed in white, and they're in fur coats.
And what year was this?
This was 1973.
1973. And so I just want to tell listeners that what Dr. Ron is saying here, or Dr. Ronald Alexander is saying here is, go back and listen to episode number 8, because he tells the rest of the story and how the original KRI, or Kundalini Research Group of scientists, came together and what was the intention, and how he began to see through it as a street kid from Boston, not impressed. I want to bring you back to present day, because I know our listeners really need to hear more about what you're speaking to, that not only were you able to see through YB early on, and that's why you left the KRI group, but then along the way, abuse victims, you help them not only as a psychotherapist, but then passing them on to colleagues that might have helped more specifically in unhooking from cult and the exit program, it sounds like. But you not only did that within watching members of 3HO, but you did that in other spiritual communities where the leader was obviously predatory, and leaving a community that you love and you're being abused in is not an easy thing. So can you speak to that, the challenge that we're faced right now, as many of us, like even using the word like separating the technology from the teacher. To me, that language in and of itself has been used within 3HO as a way to not face the reality of abuse. It's just a way to bypass. And so I would like you to distinguish that language, because on the essence of it, I like it because there's real, and then there's the abuse wrapped around what's real. And how do we heal when it's hard to tell the difference?
Well, that's very well said. I'll just fill in the blanks around everything that you said, because what you said is very impactful, and I will elucidate on it and amplify it. Friends of mine, Ron and Mary Hulnick, who were the founders of the University of Santa Monica, they often use the phrase spiritual bypassing. And so, I think even some feedback I got after the first podcast that I did, that some people did not like me saying that the technology though still stands on its own. And I even used the phrase, because I think you asked me in podcast 8, did I think Yogi Bhajan was a master? So I'd like to just address
You've paused.
That many of the spiritual teachers that I studied with, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, Yogi Bhajan, I never studied with Baker Roshi, but I worked with many of the Zen students from the San Francisco Zen Center and Tassajara Zen Center. And it always struck me that there was this same similar thread, which was the bad behavior of the teacher, but a certain kind of integrity to that of which was being taught. And so, for example, with Yogi Bhajan, people oftentimes feel that because of his corrupt and bad behavior, that it corrupts all of the technology and the teachings. And I think what people need to do individually, and that's part of any good trauma healing, and I'm trained in the system of Peter Levine's somatic experiencing trauma healing, and that's, you have to separate out the traumatizing event and or what is called in the spiritual schools of thought, the trauma that's left over from the bad behavior of the teacher that spills onto and pollutes and infects and soils the integrity of the spiritual medium and or the spiritual method that's being taught. And so, for example, it's as basic of, once I was mugged in Boston, and it was in front of an Italian restaurant. Well, have I gone through a period where I never ate Italian food again? Well, fortunately, I got into therapy to deal with that traumatic event. And so one of my favorite forms of eating out is an Italian restaurant, because the traumatizing event was separated from the association, the negative association with that there was a mugging in front of an Italian restaurant.
But if it could have stayed in your body, where then you would have stayed associating the memory of a traumatic event to Italian food, and then therefore you could go on in life and not like Italian food for the rest of your life and not even know why.
Yes, and that's what we call the collapsing between the traumatizing event and then the system or the school of teaching or the technology. And when they collapse together, there's a fusion and a negative confluence. And
so in this instance, one could not be able to say chant a mantra or meditate or do yoga practices or dynamic movements with breath, because their unconscious or their body association would automatically link it to triggers associated with the trauma. Therefore, those two have collapsed on each other.
Very nicely said. That's right.
Okay,
And
so keep going. Sorry.
so it's important that when someone is leaving a spiritual system or a spiritual technology where they have been traumatized, abused, used, defrauded, misused, it's important to work with the separating out of the traumatizing events, or in a way of like being in a cult, is the whole system of thought, is to separate out all of the unwholesome, what we call in Buddhist psychology, unwholesome negative belief systems, the unwholesome ways of thinking, feeling, associating with the abusive teacher. And so, for example, for several years, I did very little Kundalini Yoga from 79 till about 81. And then I started practicing Ashtanga Yoga. And in one of my trips to India, one of the teachers I was working with had also been involved in Kundalini Yoga, but not with Yogi Bhajan. And so I rediscovered it, having spent the couple of years in psychotherapy, sorting out all of the negative associations and the negative triggers. So I think it's really important that if somebody is suffering, which many people who have been abused in our within the 3HO system, people are very much suffering, and that if they can get the proper help, especially I would highly recommend the somatic experiencing therapy, Ericksonian mind-body therapy, Gestalt therapy, all very useful tools for addressing what is called core level trauma, where a person's nervous system is then locked in either the patterns of fight, flight, or freeze. And they're, in essence, the deer in front of the headlights, because they sat in front of a spiritual teacher and they had an open heart, and they involved themselves for many, many years and gave up and sacrificed, and then only to find out that the teacher is trying to seduce them and or did seduce them, rape them, physically beat them. That all of that needs attention. When it's unattended to, then something like any system of spirituality can then re-trigger them. And so, for example, as I said, I started first in Zen meditation. So I was, any of the negative teachings and the negative influences from Yogi Bhajan, they didn't spill over into what I found first.
Because you had a foundation first.
That's right. And it was a foundation. That's right. And it was a foundation. I studied Zen first at the Trappist Monastery outside of Amherst, Massachusetts, in Spencer. And the Christian monks who I would sit with on a weekly basis had brought in, there was a fellow named Father Kennedy. And he was ordained, I think, in the lineage of Bernie Glassman, Roshi Bernie Glassman, which is called the White Plum Sangha. But, I could be incorrect on where he was ordained. But he would come and he would teach the Trappist monks at this monastery Zen. And so that's where I learned it. And so I was able to quickly re-embrace Zen without it polluting my entire approach to spirituality.
So I'd like to clarify something, because I really appreciate what you're saying in terms of when one has experienced spiritual abuse or practices that a teacher has then abused them, then the associations are linked in our somatic memory. So therefore one can collapse and associate these things and never be able to practice really good practices again, because they're always triggered, whether it's through meditation or chanting or community events or whatever. The question I have in relation to YB and the opinion is, there's been documentation that he actually didn't have the history or the yogic background that he kind of narrated he did, and that he was actually pulling different practices from different practices and putting it together and calling it something. So in having a relationship, say with Kundalini Yoga, you said not related to Yogi Bhajan. My question is this. I know that, say, breath has nothing to do with YB. Nervous system has nothing to do with him. Dynamic movement, meditation, chanting, like all these things are truths into and of themselves. Do you feel like he created a body of work that was actually something that he delivered, or was he just taking practices that existed and he delivered it like any good cult leader would as a new identity?
Well, I think my answer to that has got to be threefold. First, I actually don't know much about his history in terms of who he studied with, who he didn't study with. What I do know, having interviewed him for many, many hours, was that he did have a fairly cohesive body of knowledge about pranayama, meditation, chanting, and asana movement. What he called, and I think is very, very important, is the reason why he always called it Kundalini Yoga as taught by Yogi Bhajan, or Yogi Bhajan, was because he knew, he was smart enough to know, because he was college educated, that eventually his past would catch up to him. And so that he was smart enough to know if he branded it as taught by Yogi Bhajan, then when he was taken to task of, well, who were the masters that you studied with, and how long did you study with them, and where they were located, and just like, I don't want to retell the story again, but I'd like people to listen to podcast 8 because of the story of he tells this incredibly grandiose story of commandeering an army helicopter at the Delhi airport by gunpoint, and being driven by the helicopter pilot to a cave in the Himalayas, and shimmering down a rope and putting the gun to the Tantra master's head. And it's just all nonsense, okay? It never occurred. It's just a kind of one of those things your crazy old Uncle Joe might tell you when he's like had his 10th beer, that it's just a giant fish story. So he knew that by branding it as taught by Yogi Bhajan, that it gave him a lot of freedom to take from many, many systems that he most likely studied. And then, I don't know where, I think Pamela would have the better insider track to this, but I would say somewhere between 1969 and 1973, when I caught up with him, is I think he underwent some kind of spiritual inner deepening, where he was able to pull from all of these other systems of meditation and pranayama training and sound current training, and even from, for that matter, Gurbani Kirtan and Gurmukhi, and the Hatha yoga practices that he studied. And I think with the inner shift that he experienced, coupled with being able to in a very kind of talented way, as most inventors of any new system, most new systems are not just pulled out of the air. They usually have histories and foundations of other systems. And for example, I'll give the example of the founder of the S training, Werner Erhard. He created the Erhard seminar training, but it was after he spent long lengths of time at the Esalen Institute studying Gestalt therapy and primal screen therapy, and he studied Scientology, and he studied mind dynamics. And then when he created S training, Erhard seminar training, it was a very profound program. And I even took it. And as a trained psychologist, I was very surprised. I actually took it with him and some of his co-trainers. And I was surprised and impressed that he had depth and that he was able to take a room of 250 people in the course of over 2 weekends and to deliver them to a very deep level of healing. Now, all of these human potential systems and spiritual systems are fraught with stories where, well, somebody went to a training or took a 10-day meditation course or 2 weeks with Yogi Bhajan and then ended up jumping off the roof of a garage on Sunset Boulevard. There was a lot of spiritual wreckage and psychological wreckage that occurred. Some of it we could absolutely attribute to the corruption in the teachers and the facilitators. But some of it, we also have to legitimately say some of those people were suicidal. They had suffered from severe depression, bipolar disorder. Some suffered with schizophrenia. And so, they met a demise, possibly triggered by the practicing of a spiritual system or a weekend workshop on human potential. But there was a pre-existing mind-body set that left them hyper vulnerable and hyper susceptible to being able to go off the edge. And
so what I hear you saying in regards to YB, and I know you have to go soon, so we're going to have to bring you back because we could just go on in so many directions. In regards to YB specifically, I hear you saying is that you interviewed him for long periods of time. You don't necessarily know his actual research background, but in terms of the mythical story he did seem to have some great knowledge in terms of all these different things. And what you're saying is that like any inventor, any new modality, let's say modality or human development process hasn't just come out of nowhere. It's built on the foundation and probably many years of study with all these other systems in which one then synthesizes it into a new body of work of sorts. And you're saying that's somewhat what you feel he might have done in terms of his delivery of what Kundalini Yoga was.
Yes, I think he actually did do that. I think he was a master synthesizer. And again, I'll just reference podcast 8.
I was going to bring that up.
Yeah. One of the significant people involved in the Facebook page, Beyond
the Cage. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. When I said in podcast 8 that I believed that he clearly had mastery over the sound current and mastery of understanding the interconnection between pranayama practice and mantra meditation. So I got a call, of course, a woman was kicking me around the barn. How could I use the term that he had mastery? He wasn't a master. He was a rapist,
manipulator.
Manipulator. All true.
I was say there's so many masters that are also master predators simultaneously, even as they're innovators and bringing forth all sorts of things that we partake in. They were also predators, whether it was any invention in time. Yes?
Yeah, I think Yogi Bhajan was a predator long before he became a yoga master of Kundalini Yoga. And to the end of his life, I think he continued it because he got away with it. Had he lived in the Me Too time, he would probably be going to prison along with Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein and the rest of these bad chaps. But shortly before I left in 1979, my co-research partner, Shama Singh, we were the early scientists studying Kundalini Yoga, and we had a 2 or 3 hour exit conversation with him. Because we told him we're going to leave, this is not for us. But we used about an hour and a half of that time to, in a very detailed way, ask him, well, are there formulas, are there axioms that you came upon such that every time you go up and you sit and you teach, it seemed to us as young scientists that you're pulling it out of your ass. You're just creating it as you go. And he said, that's true. But he said, but I stumbled upon either internally or through his own yogic practice prior to 73. I'm not so sure he did much sadhana or practiced much of anything after 73, other than that he read from the Guru Granth Sahib. Pam verified that to me when I saw her in December in Maui. She said that he did read daily. It was either from the Guru Granth Sahib or some Sikh teaching. He did say in our exit interview that he clearly had come upon these axioms where if you applied these breath patterns with these mantras, and then you matched them with what I think he just pulled out of his hat, particular yogic postures, where he would then say, well, the yogic posture is for digestion and for cleaning the mind of negativity, negative thinking, that there was a certain amount of wholesome mastery of what he was teaching in the technology. And again, I want to say, because we're on record, I think 90% though of what he taught in lectures was horseshit. And if you listen really closely, tonight we're going to be talking and we're going to be discussing neutral mind. The pearl was in the first 2 to 5 minutes, because we transcribed these lectures and then wrote them up and had artists draw the photos of the postures. In transcribing 100, 200, 300 lectures, it's part of why I left. It was like, this is all nonsense. I'm working on getting a doctorate in psychology, and this is like garbage. But the first 2 to 5 minutes, that's where the pearls were. But the rest was just stream of consciousness rap that made no sense about much of anything. Particularly his teachings on anything that had to do with psychology and humanology. And I don't think I referenced it in podcast 8, but if I did, forgive me, but I don't think I did. In 1976, me and my former wife, Ishwara Khalsa, had been called in. We were in this 10-day Tantra course with him up in Santa Cruz. And so he called us in, and because he knew we were both working on our doctorates in psychology. And he said, Ishwara and Shama, tell me about how do you explain homosexuality? Like, what is it? Is it a disease? Is it a psychopathology? And he was obsessed with anal sex with women, in this conversation. And he was obsessed with, does it make, if a heterosexual man likes to have anal sex with a woman, is it maybe like he's maybe homosexual? And it was clear. We both looked at each other and we went like, this isn't even psychology 101. I mean, like, first of all, homosexuality is not psychopathological at all. It just is what it is. Whether it's genetic, whether it's a preference, whether it's Some people are what's called a bisexual. Some people today are called non-binary. You know, they don't identify with either gender. But he had almost next to no understanding. And I think it has to do with what Pamela and I talked about in December on Maui. He'd been raised by Christian nuns. And so he had a very Catholic, a very Christian understanding of sex, which probably led to some of the perversion and some of the twistedness of how he liked to humiliate, denigrate women. Some of the very, very, which I'm not going to get into.
The sadistic horror, the sadistic abuse, and then the disguise of the grace of God, like to elevate the woman and then to abuse her simultaneously, to me is like really something I've had to spend a lot of years unpacking out of my body, of like how it's showed up as self-abuse. I just want to reiterate and ask you really to just say, I hear you saying there's mastery, and you can hold the fact that he was a sadistic predator, and you're holding both.
Yeah, holding both, and not excusing by holding the mastery and saying, does Kundalini Yoga work as taught by Yogi Bhajan? Yes, it does. And how do I know that? Because if I do, and I do some of the practices to this day, you know, my main bailiwick is mindfulness and Tibetan Buddhist practices. But if I do, and I practice some Kundalini yoga meditations on a daily basis, I know they work because I do them. And then I pay attention to what I subjectively experience. And so
Pause. I don't know if that part is included in the way the teachings were delivered. You pay attention to what happens reflectively in your body after doing a practice.
And excellent. And that's a wonderful witnessing thought to the conversation. Because he wanted to be all powerful and all knowing, he didn't encourage what we call self-reflective thinking to discern what works and what doesn't work. And so, for example, there are a few practices, can't think of them. I don't want to give Sat Kriya a bad name, but there's a couple of Kriyas that I would never do again, because after I do them, I feel tired, drained, depleted, and bummed out. And that's my subjective experience. However, if Tej Ka Khalsa, a modern day Kundalini teacher, if she practices it and she tells me that she gets a positive benefit from it, then I'm not at odds with that, because that's her subjective experience versus my own subjective experience.
But if that teacher tells you you should be getting that, and if you're not getting that, then it's because you're not doing X, 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 and X, because you're not doing a better enough sadhana, or this or that, or this or that, which is often how this technology is delivered. It's not to create a reflective experience of what is my body feeling. And this is a part of the distinction I'm making, is that he, what I feel, mixed up really excellent nervous system, certain types of historical pranayama, mantras from the Sikh religion, real historical rooted practices, but convoluted them in the delivery, in which a lot of us don't know how to track our own body, because we're listening to the teacher around what we should be feeling versus what we're actually feeling.
Yeah, wonderfully said again. And that's because gurus, and most of them are false and fake, when they want to control your mind, your behavior, and have themselves to be the ultimate authority, rather than teaching you. See, a real guru is a cooked goose for example, Ram Dass's guru, Neem Karoli Baba, whom he studied with in India for several years. He was already there, and there was a coherency and a cohesiveness to how he taught and what he taught. But everything was always about trust your self-experience. And in psychoanalytic self-psychology, the three forerunners, Heinz Kohut, Robert Stolorow, and George Atwood, they all emphasize the importance of self-reflective thinking about any philosophy, any psychology, any spiritual methodology, any spiritual technology that you undergo, to pay attention to what your own subjective experience phenomenologically is versus what you're being told you should experience. Now, there's nothing wrong, for example, with being told, well, if you do Sat Kriya for 31 to 61 minutes, you're going to cleanse your nervous system. Well, try it. I mean, like, if I do it tonight after this interview, I guarantee, Nishan, I'm going to experience a lot of sweating. And when I lay down into Shavasana, I will probably feel in a great state of harmony and equanimity. But somebody else who might be in a traumatized state, if they were told to do Sat Kriya, it might remind them that they were hung in their closet and tied up as a child and left there for 2 days. And so that when they practice Sat Kriya, no, they don't get a sense of mind, body, energy cleansing. What they get is a re-traumatization of early life abuse. So people have to sort out the control over their own mind, regain and recapture that, to then just discern in what we call Gestalt therapy, the way that you sort out a negative introject. And negative introjects come from belief systems, thought systems, and even emotional indoctrinational systems that we take in from the outside, in essence, like an apple, we swallow it whole. Well, if you ever tried to eat a whole apple as a kid, it doesn't digest. Oftentimes it just comes out all at once. But what Gestalt therapy teaches us is that if you bite into the apple and you like the taste of it, and then you continue to chew on the experience, metaphorically, because you liked the taste of the apple, then you chew the experience and it goes down and it digests through your digestive tract, and then it adds to the nutrition of your physiology. On the other hand, in Gestalt therapy, we know that if you bite into the apple of experience and it tastes sour or bitter or incongruent, it's important to spit it out. And so that's what we call in Gestalt therapy, how you learn to discern and discriminate between wholesome experience and unwholesome experience that comes from my experience. I know this, not because I was told to know it, but I know it because I've thought it through. I've read about it. I've studied it. And then I embrace it. I practice it. I interact through the prism of that, or the stencil of that imprint. And it produces over time more positive or more wholesome life experience. Or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, and for example, many people who were victims of trauma in 3HO and the other spiritual systems, they continued to introject from the teacher that the reason that the yoga or the meditation or the mantras weren't making them feel happy or delivering them to bliss or ecstasy or a state of equilibrium or equanimity, was because inherently they weren't doing it right, or they didn't hold the right belief, or they needed to do it longer. Horseshit. Horseshit. It was because those methods don't match.
They're not in resonance with what that person needs for whatever reason. You don't have to know why, you just have to trust that it's not in resonance. Even if this teacher is telling you this is what you should do, if your body's saying no, listen to yours first.
Exactly. In the body never lies. George Goodhart, who was a famous chiropractor from the Midwest in the early 70s, always taught the body never lies. Yes. And I think modern day somatic trauma expert, Bessel van der Kolk, who has a series of new books.
The Body Keeps Score, original one, and several more. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he, as well as myself, we embrace our body because it's intimately connected to our unconscious. And our unconscious is intimately connected to our nervous system. If you listen to what your body is telling you, in Buddhist psychology, all phenomena can be divided between wholesome, positive experience, neutral, kind of vanilla, and or painful, unwholesome, negative self-experience. And so if you use that as kind of a stencil for when you're doing a spiritual system, whether it's vinyasa flow yoga or Kundalini yoga. Some people get injured in vinyasa flow yoga and they need to go to a more gentle hatha yoga system. Some people who practice Ashtanga yoga can embrace Kundalini yoga and they find that it's just a wonderful complement. Like, for example, there's a vinyasa flow yoga teacher named Tommy Rosen. Him and his wife Kira, they practice Kundalini yoga. You might want to interview them.
They interweave a lot of their practices that they've distilled, that they know work for them. I know that's beautiful.
Yeah, and they teach, you know, in the way that I teach, which is, don't listen to me. Listen to yourself. Listen to what your body's telling you. Mm-hmm. So if I teach a particular yogic or meditative approach, I say, don't listen to what I say it's supposed to do. Listen to what your body tells you it did. Listen to, did it calm down and bring your nervous system to a place of settling in calm abiding and equanimity? Or did it actually flip you in a paradoxical way into a really bizarre and painful state? And if so, don't do it.
So I want to bring up the challenge I've experienced, because I really appreciate what you're saying in terms of somatic therapy and that the body always knows and learning to trust the body. And I really want listeners to really hear the authors he's speaking to, because it's brilliant work, you know, really learning to trust our bodies.
Yeah, like Peter Levine's
book, Waking the Tiger.
In his second book, any of Bessel van der Kolk's books on trauma.
This is my question in relation to the teachings, because while YB might have been a predator teacher, and if we put this body of work as still saying it's a technology that works, the problem I have is my body knew it was somehow not right. And so what I learned was that I had been trained that into opposite. So when you had just said, if something doesn't feel painful, if something feels painful and not wholesome, then maybe that's not for me. What I had learned in growing up in this culture was that if it wasn't painful, then my identity didn't exist. It was like my identity was steeped in, it had to be painful for it to be of value. It was almost like my system had regulated itself to pain and abuse, and it was called peace. Yeah. It had been called enlightenment, and I realized that's not actually peace. That's called hypervigilance.
Yes. Yeah. Mania. Let me unpack that real quickly. You and I have similar body types, and I think similar nervous systems. the 5.5 years that I actually did the physical part of Kundalini Yoga, I was in constant back pain, and I was seeing a chiropractor sometimes 2 and 3 times a week. And then shortly before I left, I took up with a guy named Jay Kronish Keshava, and he had been trained by Mr. Iyengar in India of Iyengar Yoga, which is the commensurate therapeutic yoga. It's just unbelievably excellent for treating pain and physical injuries. So when I switched over from Kundalini Yoga, the asana part, to Iyengar Yoga, and then from there I went on to study Vinyasa Yoga and Ashtanga Yoga, my back pain went away. And I hardly ever have back pain as a result of doing yoga, but I don't do Kundalini Yoga. I don't do those posture sequences. They're not right for my body. They're obviously right for the thousands of people who do it and for their bodies. The thing to unpack is that when you're told that inherently there's something wrong with you because a particular spiritual or psychological system isn't delivering you to well-being or healing, that's the corruption in the exchange between the corrupt teacher who's trying to control your mind and control what you think, control what you feel, from the actual paying attention to, oh, well, the whole notion of if there's no pain, there's no gain.
Right, because they were saying, oh, well, you just got to get that past that part because that's just your nervous system adjusting. Oh, that's just you moving through the Akashic records. Oh, that's just, and it's when now they're plucking all the reasons why staying in pain is actually what your soul has to do. You're not doing enough seva. You're not doing enough simran. You're not doing enough. And so then the teachings themselves start getting bolstered in a spiritual abusive way, instead of teaching people, no, slow the roll, feel your body, what's going on there. Does that diet actually work, or are you actually getting hooked on the kind of sociopathic, narcissistic, somebody else knows more about me than I know about me?
Exactly. And any sophisticated practitioner of Ashtanga Yoga, Iyengar Yoga, Vinyasa Flow Yoga, and even some of the power yoga teachers will tell you that when you press up against the boundary between discomfort involved in a stretch and physiological pain, stop. That yoga is not a competition. I learned from Shiva Ray, the esteemed Vinyasa flow teacher. Yoga, Dr. Ron, is not a competition. Don't look around the room. Just focus on your own body experience. That's a respect and a reverence for what works, what doesn't work, and where my boundary of self-experience needs to begin and needs to end. And on that note, I gotta end.
Can't thank you enough. Really, really appreciate you. Please let listeners know where they can find you again, and what your upcoming book is.
My upcoming book is called Core Creativity, A Mindful Approach to Accessing Your Creative Abilities. It'll be out in spring of 2022 from Roman and Littlefield Publishers out of New York. And you can find me on ronaldalexander.com and on openmindtraining.com.
Thank you so much. Namaste. We'll have you back again soon.
Yep.
Listeners, I can't encourage you enough to go back and listen to our original episode number 8, if you want to know more of his history. I also encourage you to be critical thinking right now, to do your own research. Please look at Philip DeSlip's research paper called From Maharaj to Mahan Tantric, the construction of Yogi Bhajan's Kundalini Yoga. And you can Google that and read that so you get your most informed version of what you've looked into, what you've researched, what your self experience is. And Dr. Ron Alexander really gave us a great lens today into how all sorts of spiritual abuse and predatory abuse has come from all different communities and continues, and it's not going anywhere. So our ability to feel what's happening in our body, to know what works for us right now versus what somebody is telling us it should or shouldn't do. And we're going to definitely have Dr. Ron back. Dr. Ron, I don't know if I'm saying his name, Dr. Ron Alexander back, because there's just a lot more to unpack when it comes to learning to know what works for us, what's right for us at any given time, and learning our body, somatic therapy, get the support you need, and make a list of questions if there's more you'd like to hear from in regards to Dr. Ron Alexander's expertise. We will definitely have him back for another conversation. All right, this concludes another episode of the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast, the untold stories of the 3HO Kundalini Yoga community. If you'd like to contribute to this podcast, you can make a one-time or monthly donation at gurunishan.com/uncomfortable conversations. If you'd like to be a guest on our podcast, please feel free to reach out to me via email at gn@gurunishan.com. You can also subscribe and follow me and support my provocative truth-telling work at gurunishan.com. Once again, listen to intention number 11. Do your own research. Draw your own conclusions. Get somatic therapy and other therapy as needed. And take the space and the time that you need to do the internal healing, because spiritual, psychological, sexual abuse, these things are very real and they live in the somatic memory of your body. Get the support you need. Thank you for listening, and we will talk to you on another episode.